thousands of tattooed men imprisoned, standing in line, is the image that many associate with our protagonist, Nayib Bukele, just as they also associate him with the image of safe and clean squares and streets with people's property and lives being protected.
I'm going to take this opportunity to send a message to the criminals who, according to rumors, want to start taking revenge on honest people at random. Do that and there won't be any meal times in the prisons. And I don't care what international organizations say, let them come protect our people, let them come take their gang members. If they care that much, we'll give them all away 2 for 1.
With an irreverent and patriotic speech, more than just the president of a republic, Bukele has become, whether people like it or not, a national and global political icon. He has become a reference point in the fight against crime, and after his strongman style of government and the imprisonment of more than 10,000 potential criminals in just a few months. He has also been accused of being a dictator and a violator of human rights. Join me to learn about the story of a crime, the political figures of the century, along with his controversial government work, which some have even called miraculous.
I am Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches, and for those who have asked how to support La Nueva Enciclopedia, I bring you the news that we have created a Patreon, with exclusive documentaries on the most controversial topics, with live seminars taught by us, and with several more benefits. Your support is essential to keep this project alive. You can find the link below. And in case you don't have an international card for Patreon, we have several options for you. You can be incorporated into the community. We're waiting for you, and without further ado, let's start today's video.
Nayib Armando Bukele Ortiz was born on July 24, 1981 in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. His family was at that time one of the most prominent in his country. His father, Armando Bukele Catan, was Salvadoran, a descendant of Christian Palestinians who emigrated from Bethlehem in 1921, and who, after their arrival, started a long business dynasty that has persisted ever since. After his father graduated as a chemist from the University of El Salvador in 1969 as the top student of his university, Armando Bukele, with an entrepreneurial spirit and a knack for business, founded several companies in the 1970s in various sectors, such as textiles, pharmaceuticals, advertising, and commerce, where, in addition, he applies his knowledge in chemistry. Standing out is the company Manufacturas Humberto Bukele and Sons, with which he amasses a considerable fortune and makes his way into the Salvadoran business elite. Later, around 1975, Don Armando, as they called him, converts to the Sunni branch of Islam and even becomes an imam, a term that refers to the person who leads prayer and the spiritual life of Sunni Muslims in the communities. In the future, he would become a promoter of the expansion of this religion in El Salvador, a country that from its origins to the present day has been predominantly Catholic. February 19, 1981, Armando Bukele marries Olga Ortiz, a Salvadoran woman of humble origins and Catholic faith from the town of Concepción de Oriente. From this union, not only is the protagonist of our video born, but also his 3 younger siblings. So Nayib Bukele grows up in this home made up of 2 different worlds. His father's Arab Muslim background with strong idiosyncratic influences from the Middle East, and the teachings of Salvadoran traditions and culture from his mother. Backed by the family fortune, from a very young age, Nayib Bukele surrounds himself with his family's privileged environment. In terms of education, connections, and other aspects, that is, his childhood is influenced by his father's character, who was strict, diplomatic, and a businessman. Even so, these days are not easy for anyone in El Salvador, since the country was going through a tough civil war in which they were fighting each other. The Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, which was a radical left-wing guerrilla group against the national government of El Salvador. To understand this conflict, you need to go back to El Salvador's independence. In 1821, when that country was going through a long series of political crises with weak and unstable governments, this would facilitate the rise of the coffee landowners as the social group that held de facto power in that country, because they had under their control, among other things, the land as the main means of production in a small and large country with scarce natural resources. With deep social differences between indigenous people, mestizos, and landowners, this creates inequalities, resentments, and conflicts that remain latent for a while. But with the progressive expansion of several movements, including communism in the 1920s in El Salvador, this would become the seed of a future leftist popular movement. So in 1930-31, the so-called coffee-growing oligarchy of El Salvador carries out a coup d'etat against then-President Arturo Araujo, leaving General Maximiliano Hernandez in power. This milestone marks the beginning of what has been historiographically called military authoritarianism in El Salvador. A series of military governments would rule the country, combined with some supervised civilian governments, which would become the political norm in El Salvador from 1931 to 1979. These military-leaning governments in El Salvador would maintain strict surveillance and control over political activity in Mayoral. They reference public order in El Salvador. They promote the modernization and industrialization of El Salvador, which until that moment had maintained an economic system based solely on coffee monoculture. So, aligned with the United States in the context of the Cold War, they receive large amounts of capital that they allocate to industrial investment and the financing of public works such as the Pan American Highway, the Coastal Highway, and national electrification. This promotes development of both the landowning oligarchy and a new commercial and industrial oligarchy, along with an emerging one. By that year, El Salvador, although it had made economic and other progress, was still 70% dependent on coffee, whose prices dropped alarmingly during this decade. This will cause a severe contraction and complication of that country's economy, which especially affects the mostly peasant population of El Salvador. This, combined with the political situation, where leftist groups were already beginning to organize into armed groups. These are the triggers for the coup d'etat against then-president by the National Police of El Salvador Carlos Romero, October 15, 1979, a date historians mark as the end of that long military-controlled regime and the beginning of the Salvadoran Civil War. Due to the escalation of violence that will soon come by October 10, 1980, this violence keeps increasing and spreading. The leftist groups managed to come together as a single group called the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, named in honor of a communist peasant who had been executed by firing squad during a Salvadoran peasant uprising. In 1932, this organization was born, 3 months after its founding and 6 months before the birth of the protagonist of our video. In January 1981, it launched the so-called Final Offensive, an operation against the Salvadoran government that would formally initiate hostilities in the Salvadoran Civil War. This conflict would last just over a decade, and that, according to estimates, would cause the death of more than 75,000 innocent civilians, 550,000 internally displaced people, and 500,000 displaced outside the country. Amid ongoing excesses from both sides on each battlefront, curfews, executions, and kidnappings, from which neither big businessmen nor anyone else was exempt. Internationally, the conflict does not go unnoticed, since the United States supports the Salvadoran army technologically and logistically, while Cuba and the Soviet Union support the Farabundo Martí Front. In the midst of all this mess, Nayib Bukele, as a member of a wealthy family, enjoys private protection. He lived in areas of San Salvador, the capital, such as Zona Rosa and San Benito, by 1986 at 5 years old. Nayib Bukele is enrolled in the Pan American School, a bilingual institution, but not one of the most exclusive. At the age of 8, Nayib Bukele is enrolled in the Pan American School, a bilingual institution, but not one of the most exclusive by the time Nayib finishes elementary school. In 1993, that is, a year after the so-called Chapultepec Accords were signed, on January 16, 1992, these agreements, mediated by the United Nations, put an end to the armed conflict, setting limits for both sides. The Salvadoran government agrees to reduce the armed forces personnel by 50%, dissolve several security entities, and initiate judicial proceedings against officials accused of human rights violations. For its part, the Farabundo Martí Front agrees to the total demobilization of its 1,000 guerrillas and its restructuring as a legal political party. In addition, a compensation of $4,600 is granted to each former combatant, and a large amount of land is distributed among them. In this way, the ceasefire becomes effective on February 1, 1992, and until today, at least in a basic initial way, that ceasefire has not been interrupted. This is the El Salvador where they grow up there, Bukele. Even so, the Chapultepec Accords have been harshly criticized for, according to some, undermining the defensive capability of the Salvadoran state in the face of violence, which, although nominally has ended, is it going to continue with vehemence in the following years? Going back to the young Nayib Bukele, who grew up in this turbulent context, in 1999, he was already 18 years old and obtained his high school diploma from the Pan American School. He briefly enrolls in the law program at José Simeón Cañas University, but he will not finish his studies as he will start working in several of his father's companies. From this year on, Nayib will begin a long managerial journey in that business world where he will develop his strategic, entrepreneurial, and businessman's vision. Just like his father, at only 18 years old, Nayib opens a nightclub called Code, right there in San Salvador, becoming one of the most exclusive and successful nightclubs of that time. This will be Nayib Bukele's first venture on his own, separate from his family's support, and in it, he learns managerial aspects such as night management, youth marketing, and handling accounting resources. Although also under his management of that nightclub, stories of illicit substance abuse and wild nights will persist, in one of which allegedly 2 young women lost their lives. In a case that was never investigated and was rather forgotten by the authorities of the time. In parallel to this personal venture, Nayib Bukele takes on executive duties at Overmed, which was his father's advertising agency, and Nayib Bukele becomes its president. At the time when Nayib is president of the Overmed agency, this orchestra is nothing less than the entire advertising strategy of the Farabundo Martí Front, formerly a socialist-leaning guerrilla group, now a political party. Their first major job was in 2004 with the presidential campaign of Shafiq Handal, who was then the general secretary of the same party. This started introducing Nayib into the business world and Nayib into the political world. Well, back then, in the early years of the 21st century, the Farabundo Martí Front is one of the main political mobilization forces in El Salvador. It was born. Notably, it had just been dollarized, which, along with other reforms, created an economic environment that allowed various business sectors to progress in the country. By 2006, Overmed began to be part of a regional alliance with the company NOLC Red America. Under the leadership and management of Nayib, the company kept growing and making numerous contacts in the regional business and political world, as well as learning valuable lessons from the world of political communication. During these years, Bukele's Overmed, together with its regional alliances, managed the advertising campaign for the Farabundo Martí Front, which achieved its first major political victory in the presidential elections of El Salvador in 2009 with its candidate Mauricio Funes for the year 2010. The Overmed agency takes another step forward and partners with a global advertising firm with a significant presence in the Central American region. And under the presidency of Nayib Bukele, the Overmed agency continues during these years directing the propaganda campaigns of the Farabundo Martí Front. Only now, at its peak as El Salvador's top political force, Nayib Bukele is in charge of several personal businesses, such as the import and sale of Yamaha motorcycles, and some government contracts, like the manufacturing of passports, which bring him significant profits for his assets. This Nayib Bukele, energetic and entrepreneurial, who had already worked on numerous political and business projects, was only 30 years old. And by the year 2011, he decides to leave his career as a businessman and fully immerse himself in Salvadoran politics, in which until then he had only been behind the scenes and from a business perspective. And he gets into politics as a member of the Farabundo Martí Front, claiming that this was a way out of his comfort zone. So by the year 2012, in the eyes of the public, Nayib Bukele leaves his businesses, not without leaving a legacy first, not only of various successful companies, but also of 12 years managing the political campaigns of the Farabundo Martí Front, and a few $1 million for carrying out these campaigns. All this experience and knowledge in managerial and financial resource management, in leadership and problem solving in the implementation of political marketing. Advertising principles throughout his business career give young Nayib a solid foundation, which moreover, conditioned by the political nature of his activity, will be a foundation and key element in his beginnings in politics, in which moreover, he enters with another great advantage, which is strong financial muscle when he joins the Farabundo Martí Front as a member. Formally, Nayib aligns himself with the leftist ideology of this movement, a party with socialist and social democratic tendencies, and even with unionists, nationalists, liberals, among others. For this reason, there are some videos on the internet where you can see Nayib Bukele saying that all my life I have been leftist and my thinking is leftist, as well as actively defending the human rights of prisoners in El Salvador, and even defending and admiring the administration of the then Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez Frias. But beyond this, for Nayib Bukele, his time with the Farabundo Martí Front more than representing unquestionable loyalty to the party. It served as a great learning center and a vehicle for political advancement for his career, his project, and his family. In this context, Nayib Bukele decides to run for mayor in the municipality in Nuevo Cuscatlán, a municipality of 8,000 people near the capital, San Salvador. In this way, on March 11, 2012, as a candidate for the Farabundo Martí Front, and financed with his own fortune and that of his family, Bukele is elected as mayor of this municipality, dedicating himself to governing with the motto, Government Action. Nayib Bukele's administration in Nuevo Cuscatlán is, for some, a reflection of what his future presidency will be like. He carries out social programs aimed at including low-income groups, such as monthly food baskets for senior citizens, improved access to services such as water, electricity, and decent housing, as well as university scholarships. Through the Rockefeller Foundation for young people who couldn't afford it, Futura carries out programs such as monthly classes for senior citizens, as well as university scholarships. He is also remembered locally in that municipality as mayor for the NUCU program, a Rockefeller brand for young people who couldn't afford the enrollment. Philosophy authors. It was because of the safety experienced in his municipality during his administration that, with a series of policies together with his management, kept crime rates quite low in that municipality. At that time in El Salvador, the violence from criminal gangs, which we will talk about later, was a serious and deeply felt problem. Throughout the country, with almost 41 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants each year. But what about Nuevo Cuscatlan? Nayib Bukele implements a strong security policy based on cooperation with public entities and private security companies. They managed to reduce the homicide rate in that municipality by 92%. In fact, during his 3 years in charge of that mayor's office, only one homicide was recorded. A remarkable aspect of Nayib Bukele as mayor is that, beyond all the public works, social programs, and economic measures he implemented, he skillfully promotes them in the media, and to capitalize on the attention not only of that municipality, but of the entire Salvadoran public to build his image among the population. Photographs that look like they were taken today show Mayor Bukele embracing and engaging with the popular masses, with whom he has sought to maintain a close relationship since the beginning of his career. But alongside that administration, considered by some to be efficient and effective, his mayoralty was not without problems and public complaints, such as the fact that in 2012 he received nearly $2 billion from Alba Petróleos, a Salvadoran subsidiary of the company Petróleos de Venezuela, Sociedad Anónima, the major state oil company of Venezuela, which at that time was led by Hugo Chavez. Money that he not only would have used to invest in his financial projects, but also to boost his own young political career. It is estimated that during those years, nearly $3.5 billion were disbursed by Alba Petróleos. Not only Nayib, but also several companies belonging to his family, as well as people who are now part of his government cabinet, such as Carolina Recinos, a scheme that is believed to have been devised by José Luis Merino, a former guerrilla commander and deputy for the Farabundo Martí Front, to which Nayib Bukele belonged. Returning to his 2014 mayorship in Nuevo Cuscatlan, he says in an interview that what he liked most about being mayor was, unlike other public positions, the closeness he had with the people in the community. In that interview, interestingly, he asked the interviewer to us, "Where do you see Nayib Bukele? Do you see yourself as presidential material in 5 years?" To which Nayib responds that the presidency is not in his plans, and that his next project, after Nuevo Cuscatlan, was San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. Indeed, he finished his term as mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlan on April 30th, 2015, in the midst of a celebrated administration, praised nationally by the Farabundo Martí Front and internationally by the United Nations, which named him a model mayor, showing Nayib at that time a great commitment to the so-called 2030 agenda, and with increasing financial resources, they present Nayib Bukele, then 34 years old, as the new face for Salvadoran politics, as well as a strong young man who, in addition to his successful management at City Hall, was seen as a profile fit for the challenges of today's world. So in March of that year, 2014, there, Bukele won with 50.37%. The mayor's office of San Salvador, with the Farabundo Martí Front, taking office as mayor of the capital of the Salvadoran nation on May 1st. Nayib will call his government program New Ideas, and will mainly focus his administration on the revitalization and transformation of the capital city's urban space. For these purposes, Nayib Bukele undertakes the relocation of vendors, plants, construction of public libraries, the renovation of historic plazas and other public spaces, as well as the expansion of public roads, in which he invests $5.7 million in the last months of his administration. Bukele also partners with various groups to carry out a large number of social initiatives and social programs, even some programs associated with the Masonic lodges that are active in El Salvador. Bukele also launched the program One Project a Day, which consisted of small public works such as drainage, lighting, electrification, repaired sidewalks, and inaugurated parks, which he also took advantage of to promote in the media. In these public works, Nayib Bukele invested nearly $500,000 in the first 5 months of his administration, benefiting around 140,000 people around those projects.
Previously, people thought the public sector was inferior to the private sector, but we've always disagreed. The public sector, being the collective inheritance, should always be superior to the private sector because it belongs to everyone.
During this period, Nayib Bukele also opened the Women's Secretariat at San Salvador City Hall, reflecting ties to that era's feminism. Bukele created this secretariat in order, I quote, to focus on gender, programs for women, and access to opportunities. He appointed his recent wife, Gabriela Rodriguez, as the head of this secretariat. He had met her one night in 2004 at the Code nightclub and helped her pursue her psychology degree. Nayib Bukele has been adapting his strategy, his discourse, and his actions according to the times and circumstances. Back in 2015, Bukele openly spoke of San Salvador as the most inclusive capital in Latin America, supporting various expressions, among other things, of so-called gender freedom and sexual diversity, and being irreverently leftist in his own words. Is there something that makes us lose the one? He complicated things and commented on what followed, but this time in the past, and he got stuck in stories. Quite low in that municipality, making different types of contracts between the mayor's office and companies that were under his management. Thus arrives the decisive year, 2017, where the Farabundo Martí Front, previously very popular, now begins a clear decline in its reputation and leadership. Meanwhile, the right-leaning party called Arena rises in the polls ahead of the 2019 presidential elections. Nayib Bukele, still as mayor, sees that this situation is a great political opportunity. There were already numerous factions within the Farabundo Martí Front Party that looked at Nayib Bukele with suspicion, just as Bukele, seeing the clear deterioration of the party, was already looking for ways to abandon that ship. The turning point comes on December 8th in a party session where a municipal trustee denounces an alleged case of corruption by Bukele when he was mayor of Cuscatlan. In the middle of the session, Nayib bites into an apple he had on hand and throws the rest at the woman who was making the accusation, while shouting at her, "Take that apple home with you, witch." This incident caused shouting, protests, and some laughter, leading the women's sector of the Farabundo Martí Front to accuse Nayib Bukele of sexist violence. After the incident, Nayib Bukele wrote the following on his Twitter: "El Salvador will be the tomb where the Reds will rest." This ended both the long-standing political and working relationships between Bukele and the Farabundo Martí Front, because the advertising agency Overmed thus ends its propaganda campaigns with the party. Nayib dedicates himself to building a new political platform and becomes the party's standard bearer. New ideas in blue and white, with a strongly anti-bipartisan message and liberal, centrist, and technocratic tendencies. A party that would also have the support of important Salvadoran businessmen based in Washington District of Columbia. In El Salvador, a bipartisan system had been created after the Civil War between the Farabundo Martí Front and the Arena Party. Bukele and his team aimed to break away from this system. With key supporters in and outside El Salvador secured, once Nayib completes his term as San Salvador's mayor. On April 30th, 2018, he starts activating all the necessary processes and operations to achieve a presidential candidacy and election. The Nuevas Ideas Party can't register in time, so he runs for office with the Grand Alliance for National Unity Party. He was seen as a young businessman and an efficient leader with 2 impeccable terms at the municipal level, and with the promise to be different from the dominant parties and to fight against the serious corruption and crime that existed in the country. Nayib Bukele also leveraged this campaign with an innovative and effective use of social media, which at that time was still something relatively new. In the world of political communication, the presidential elections were held in February of the year 2019. There's an air of uncertainty, but on the same day, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal awards Nayib Bukele the electoral victory with 53.8% of the votes. Thus, at 37 years old and in the midst of a historic milestone for El Salvador, the young Nayib Bukele takes over the presidency of the republic. What had been his father's dream, who had passed away in November of 2015, was coming true. And now, Nayib Bukele was determined, like never before, to radically change the life of the Salvadoran nation. Nayib Bukele was sworn in as president of El Salvador on June 1, serving from 2019 to 2024. The El Salvador he encounters is complex. A stagnant economy with insufficient gross domestic product growth, high public debt, low foreign investment, and a heavy reliance on remittances from Salvadorans living abroad, and a population of at least 6.2 million people, of which approximately 26% lived in extreme poverty. The informal economy was also the most common form of employment, and Salvadoran migration was one of the largest in the Central American region. And perhaps the main problem in El Salvador at that time was the violence it was experiencing. The country had a homicide rate of 51 per 1,000 inhabitants annually, and with 90% of the municipalities having a strong presence of the same gangs, which affected all aspects of the nation and the country's development. So in this context, in his first days in office, Nayib Bukele launched the so-called Cuscatlan Plan with the goal of addressing several strategic areas. First, the country's security would be the main focus and included the so-called Territorial Control Plan, whose mission was to recover the national territory from criminal gangs and dismantle them. The second focus was the implementation of megaprojects like the Pacific Train and the Pacific Airport. Third, a substantial improvement in institutions related to social security, education, public health, and other aspects of social welfare. The fourth focus was to promote the transition of the government apparatus and the country's economy to the digital era. Among other things, to promote foreign investment, especially in the area of technology. And finally, the fifth focus, the thorough fight against corruption. This government program is received with great enthusiasm among the population, and although its initial execution is somewhat hindered, the plan gets off to a full start. As we mentioned, violence was the main obstacle for Salvadorans, which in addition hindered Bukele's main plans. The levels of delinquency and crime that in June 2019, Bukele's Territorial Control Plan launched its first major offensive against gangs and crime, with more than 3,000 soldiers and 2,500 police officers deployed. In just 2 months, around 39,000 suspected criminals and gang members were imprisoned. Many gangs were dismantled in 12 municipalities, with most of the country's urban population were reclaimed. Key among them is the restoration of San Salvador's historic center. In addition to this, so-called urban centers of well-being and opportunities are being created in the municipalities previously controlled by gangs. aiming to keep young people from crime. At the same time, the technology of El Salvador's police and armed forces is being seriously modernized in every way. This leads to an initial concrete decrease in violence from 2019 to 2020, where homicides drop from 51 to 38 per thousand inhabitants annually. This happens within the framework of the so-called zero tolerance against gang members and the restructuring of the national penitentiary system. This zero tolerance program against gang members also involves the restructuring of the national penitentiary system, a system that, according to some, was also used by the gangs themselves to expand their crimes. Nayib Bukele is dedicated to rebuilding a large part of this penitentiary infrastructure and recovering it, or even expanding it. In this way, he can enforce the sentences imposed on Salvadorans by the justice system and imprison as many criminals or even innocents as necessary.
In El Salvador, we put our honest citizens' safety first. Over the comfort of criminals, some say we have imprisoned thousands, but the reality is that we have freed millions. Now it's the good people who live free, without fear, with their freedoms and human rights fully respected.
This would be the beginning of a one-of-a-kind operation in recent continental history in terms of security and fighting crime. Bukele is dedicated to contradicting the thesis that it was operationally unfeasible for a Latin American state to quickly and forcefully neutralize a large number of criminal gangs. These mass arrest operations, in turn, have caused collateral damage, as well as innocent people imprisoned, which we will talk about later. In the same way, it has produced exceptional results regarding its objectives of fighting crime and generating peace and security for citizen development. The data makes this clear. The homicide rate in El Salvador fell from 2015 to 2024 to 100. 3 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants to 1.9 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants per year. At the same time, Nayib Bukele creates the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, a commission together with the Organization of American States to prosecute those accused of corruption during previous governments. In the midst of that struggle to implement these territorial control and citizen security programs, in the year 2020 on February 9th, an unprecedented event occurs in recent Salvadoran history, which produces the first waves of both applause and rejection for Nayib Bukele. The Parliament of El Salvador was in the hands of the opposition and had been refusing for some time to approve funding of $9 million for the next phase of the ambitious territorial control plan, Bukele's famous program for citizen security and fighting crime. After several days of political maneuvers for and against, the atmosphere becomes increasingly tense, and Bukele calls for a demonstration at the parliament, where he ends up entering the chamber as president with the military to demand that the loan be approved for the good of the people. When he enters, Bukele sits in the chair of the president of the assembly and strikes the gong to start a session that was not valid anyway, since there were only 22 out of 84 deputies present. Bukele covers his face with his hands and remains silent for a couple of minutes, appearing to be praying to God. After praying, he stands and tells his followers, "God told me patience, patience, patience." The conflict continues for weeks and months without a clear resolution. But Bukele's image in parliament is still deeply engraved in a Salvadoran population tired of the old political class. This reinforces the image of Nayib Bukele as an unconventional leader, autocratic in the classic sense, and someone who steps outside institutional formalities, putting, in his own words, the interests of the people and the nation above democratic formalities. At this same time, Nayib Bukele launches his foreign policy program, which remains in effect to this day. He strengthens ties with both the United States of America and China, and receives generous trade agreements from both, as well as funding to boost El Salvador's economy. While the United States and China compete and clash in other parts of the world to lead investments and agreements, Bukele's El Salvador remains neutral and negotiates with both sides indiscriminately. These international and economic relations, together with the expansion of public spending to stimulate the country's economy, are generating an economic upturn. In El Salvador, this is reflected in a 0.4% increase in gross domestic product in that first year, from 2019 to 2020. However, shortly after the start of his term in that same year, 2020, he faces his first major crisis, the global quarantine. Nayib, faced with this situation, closes all the country's borders and decrees measures that subject the population to strict confinement conditions. This situation causes ongoing clashes with other branches of power, like the judiciary, legislative, and even the business sector. He scolds them in a famous speech because they were seeking exceptions or relaxations to the quarantine measures that were implemented.
There are also some businessmen who are worried because they're going to be 10, 15, or even 20% less wealthy. Look, believe me, you have enough money to live 10 lives, 20 lives. In other words, you won't live long enough to spend it all. Consider your future when you might need our care, especially since your age puts you at high risk. If you need a bed and struggle to breathe, your bank account will be the least of your worries. You'll need a mechanical ventilator so we can intubate you and help you breathe. So, don't be thinking about losing 20% of your capital. Yes, you are going to lose 20% of your capital. Thank God that you still have the other 80%. There are people who don't have anything to eat tonight.
This year, the economy contracts, impacting all levels of the population. Even so, although the economy suffers some contraction and poverty increases slightly, in 2021, Bukele's government launched a second major offensive of the Territorial Control Plan, expanding the number of police officers and security forces who gained control of new municipalities that had previously remained red zones, and carrying out a major operation in which tens of thousands of potential gang members were arrested with this second offensive of the Territorial Control Plan. Homicides in El Salvador dropped from 38 to 19.7 per 100,000 inhabitants between 2020 and 2021. Not only placing El Salvador higher and higher in the security rankings of Latin America, but also gradually becoming a sort of international reference for all those countries and cities with significant levels of crime. This is how Nayib Bukele is gaining ground, worldwide notoriety, and despite governing a small country, he is emerging as a reference in the fight against crime, especially in the Spanish-speaking region. The images of gang members in prison, lined up and subdued by prison guards, are seen all over the world and catapult his fame, as well as the controversies and criticisms. By the year 2021, quarantine restrictions begin to be lifted, and the economy starts to rebound, along with the new spirit that had emerged among the population due to the greater security and peace that was being felt. A noticeable growth in the Salvadoran economy began to take place, which continued to strengthen. Additionally, with the unprecedented decision by Bukele to adopt Bitcoin as the second official currency of El Salvador, alongside the United States dollar. In that year, 2021, there was also a slight rift between him and the then United States President Joe Biden, as well as numerous international organizations, since Biden, along with these organizations, began to accuse several of Bukele's closest officials of alleged corruption and money laundering. Besides the organizations accusing him of allegedly creating a dictatorship in El Salvador against the region's democratic values. But beyond this, in El Salvador, the majority of the Salvadoran people view Nayib Bukele's government positively, the results of which have been increasing his popularity throughout the country, reaching, at different times, approval ratings close to 90% of the population. This explains why, in the parliamentary elections held that year, Bukele's Nuevas Ideas Party won 64 out of 84 seats in the Legislative Assembly, now controlling both the parliament and the presidency. Nayib Bukele proceeds to remove judges from the Supreme Court and the Attorney General of the Republic. And he replaces them with people close to his project and, in his judgment, more competent, securing control over both the legislative and judicial branches. In September 2021, El Salvador's Constitutional Chamber reinterpreted a constitutional article, enabling Bukele to do what he previously couldn't. Will he seek a second presidential term in El Salvador? This decision by the Constitutional Chamber causes a stir amid applause from many Salvadorans, but also with the condemnation of multiple international organizations that said a supposed dictatorship was being established for the year 2022. The government of Nayib Bukele decides to put a definitive end to the criminal gangs of El Salvador with the so-called total war on the Maras, in which Nayib Bukele declares a state of emergency that lasts for 6 months, during which they proceed to capture and prosecute 50,000 alleged gang members. Amid applause from many Salvadorans and condemnation from international organizations, an unprecedented police operation is carried out in the history of El Salvador and much of Latin America. This was a massive and lethal operation, which had already had 2 important precedents. And it hit like a burst in all the areas where many of these gangs operated. On the other hand, multiple organizations have reported the imprisonment of a significant number of innocent people, which has not yet been clarified. In El Salvador, according to estimates, more than 1,000 people with no connection to gangs have been detained. Over these years, many have been released, but many others remain detained. As part of this work, in 2023, one of his most controversial projects is launched, the so-called Terrorism Confinement Center, better known as the SECOT, a mega prison for 40,000 people whose images have gone around the world. All this government program is taking place in parallel with a strong tourism incentive program, in which El Salvador is positioning itself as one of the most attractive and safest tourist destinations in Central America, where, in addition, his government is applauded by internationally recognized figures such as Donald Trump, Elon Musk, or Javier Milei. Already in the last days of his first term, the presidential election is held in El Salvador, and Nayib Bukele, unsurprisingly, wins re-election in February of 2024 with a historic 85% of the vote from the electoral roll, extending his term until 2029.
With God's help, with the effort of the Salvadoran people and the work of the government, we achieved results better than even we could have dreamed of.
Just like in his first term, Nayib Bukele is adopting an increasingly patriotic and pragmatic tone, focused on concrete solutions to concrete problems, but also on the idea that the national interest and the public interest, as well as the will of God, should guide the actions of the Salvadoran government. In turn, Bukele is asking Salvadorans this year, and I quote, to take the bitter medicine. Referring to the economic amendments and adjustments, including fiscal austerity measures and large-scale layoffs, also within the public sector to reduce the budget deficit, which has been presenting itself as a problem up to the present day. In the midst of all this, he takes advantage of his new term to materialize what he calls the digital government, a plan in partnership with a major global corporation, which is Google Cloud, and other information technology companies, to advance the complete digitalization of exports, the paperwork and government processes. By the end of 2025 and into 2026, compared to the nation inherited over 6 years ago, today's El Salvador presents itself as a safer, more peaceful society with better conditions for the economic development of workers and business growth. With a significant tourism and technology boom that is also moving toward a more diversified and less indebted economy, which every day is more in tune with the digital forefront of the world. A country, moreover, that maintains relations with both superpowers, the United States and China, though not without problems and controversies. Several facts about Bukele's administration explain why he has the approval of 85% of the Salvadoran people. It's not just the constant growth of the gross domestic product. There's also the diversity and variety of public works programs and social projects. But above all, it's that great intangible benefit of being able to go out on the street without the fear of becoming a victim of a criminal. And Nayib Bukele has been able to make the most of this administration to present himself as a popular leader who is more effective than the traditional mechanisms of democracy. And even though there are still reports of infringements on freedoms and rights, Nayib Bukele has gained strong support in political and social movements, not only from El Salvador, but from all over the world, even using, for example, the aesthetics of the old founding fathers' independence adapted to our time. He has worked with influencers like Luisito Comunica and the GREFG, and met personalities like Donald Trump and Elon Musk. This is how Bukele governs El Salvador, with an iron fist, an almost non-existent political opposition, the highest approval rating on the continent, and with all branches of government in his favor. Scholars say that the so-called Bukelato will last beyond 2029, and that Nayib Bukele Ortiz, son of the Bukele dynasty of El Salvador, amid strong criticism and support, will continue to exercise power in a Caesarist manner to carry out the personal and collective dream that the once lost nation of El Salvador fulfills, quote, its destiny of being an example for the world. Thank you for watching. Your support is greatly appreciated. By commenting, liking, subscribing, sharing the video with friends, and clicking the bell for notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.